Anneliese Marie Frank was a Jewish girl born on June 12, 1929 in Germany. After Hitler's rise to power, she and her family, father Otto, mother Edith, and older sister Margot, immigrated to the Netherlands, living and thriving until 1940, when the Germans invaded. On July 6, 1942, after Margot was called up to a work camp, the Frank family went into hiding. Right in the heart of Amsterdam, they lived in secret in the back house of the building in which Otto Frank had run his pectin and spice business, his own office staff tending for them and keeping them secret. The Frank family, along with another family, the Van Pelzes, and the dentist Fritz Pfeffer, lived in hiding for just over 2 years, until, on August 4, 1944, the Nazis finally found them, arrested them, and put them in concentration camps. Sadly, of the 8 people in hiding, only Otto Frank survived. However, Anna kept a diary of her experiences, unknowingly leaving behind a voice that might go on living even after her death. It was miraculously recovered, and her father published it in 1947 under the title Het Achterhuis, the back house, or the secret annex. 5 years later, it was translated into English under the title The Diary of a Young Girl. In the decades since, it has become one of the most widely read books in the entire world, and Anna Frank has become one of the most recognized victims of the Holocaust. Hello. Wow, clearly this is different than what I typically cover on my channel. Something far more serious and far more real. Please be advised that this video contains discussions of anti-Semitism, the Holocaust, and concentration camps. So what am I even doing here? Well, about this time 2 years ago, I suddenly realized that I had never read this book. Throughout my entire formal education, it was never assigned to me. I decided to fix that. I checked it out from the library, and I found myself enraptured by it. Like so many readers of so many generations, Anna Frank became a friend to me. I found myself transfixed by her every word, unable to put it down. Then I felt guilty for not putting it down, realizing that every page I turned was bringing her closer to her doom. For a moment, I even believed that if I stopped reading, I could stop the inevitable. After I finished reading it, I read every book on the subject, watched every documentary, every adaptation I could get my hands on. Last summer, I had the opportunity to visit the Netherlands, my first ever trip out of the US. And while I was there, I made it a point to visit the actual Anna Frank house. I stepped behind the bookcase facade covering the entrance to their hiding place. I got to walk through the actual rooms they lived in for those 2 years. To say it was overwhelming would be a massive understatement. Clearly, I find this story personally meaningful. Given the increase of anti-Semitism specifically, and demonization of other groups in general over the past few years, it's an important reminder of what happens when we dehumanize our fellow humans. The Diary of Anneliese Frank is part of a grand storytelling tradition. It's by all means a true story, but a story nonetheless. A diary, for example, is a specific method of framing a story. Its first-person perspective grants the reader intimate access to the writer's thoughts and feelings. Anna framed her entries as letters to a fictional friend, meaning she is literally talking to the reader. By reading it, we step into the shoes of Dear Kitty. It's a story deeply embedded in our culture, which is why, despite never having read it, I knew enough about it to realize I hadn't. I couldn't even tell you how I first knew it, I just somehow always did. That's how ubiquitous it is. And the best, most pervasive stories are passed down, retold, reimagined into plays, documentaries, graphic novels, movies, animation. The nature of adaptations, how stories are altered through different lenses, especially between different types of media, has always fascinated me. Documentaries always have a viewpoint, but we would be aghast if one started straight up changing the facts. But for biopics, we expect that the details are going to be fudged and simplified to various degrees in order to fit a certain structure. So while there are countless meaningful topics here, I feel exploring how the story of Anna Frank has been fictionalized is the best one for me to share. I clearly can't look at them all, so I'm focusing on 3 examples, each having a wildly different focus while still maintaining much in common. They are the 1959 Academy Award-winning film The Diary of Anne Frank.
We're trying to hold on to some kind of ideals when ideals, hope, everything's being destroyed.
The 2001 ABC television movie Anne Frank, sometimes referred to as Anne Frank the Whole Story.
I long for everything. I've decided something.
What?
After the war, I'm going to live.
And the 2009 BBC miniseries The Diary of Anne Frank.
I'm going to have a different life to most girls. I don't want to be like Mother or all those other women who have a family and then they're forgotten. I don't want to have lived in vain like most people.
It seems I can't get away from this topic on my channel. Pronunciation. You've probably already noticed that I have been saying Anna instead of the more common English pronunciation of Anne. Believe me, no one was more surprised than I was to find out that that's how her name is spoken.
Anne Frank.
At first I assumed the 1959 movie popularized the Anne pronunciation. It just seemed like a 1950s Hollywood thing to do. But they very much don't.
Hot tone. Anna.
They always yell at us, Anna and Sana, the skinny bananas.
The motion picture, the book, and the play are widely referred to as the Diary of Anne Frank. Otto Frank called his daughter Anna, and in the film she is referred to as Anna.
I am not Dutch or German, so I don't expect to be able to say everything accurately. I'll do my best, but I'd like to, as closely as I can, say the names of the people involved the way they would have said them. So here's how I'm going to handle this. When I talk about the actual person, I will say Anna. When I talk about the fictionalized versions, I will say the name however the work in question pronounces it. "1959's The Diary of Anne Frank is actually an adaptation of an adaptation, converting Francis Goodrich and Albert Hackett's 1955 stage play of the same name. It even features 3 performers from the Broadway cast. The stage show is still performed to this day, so chances are if you are familiar with any adaptation of the story, it's this one. It's also the quintessential example of a dramatization. While it certainly gets across the main themes, ideas, and events from the real diary, its focus is telling a compelling story in a visual medium, easily digestible to an audience, rather than capturing every historical detail. Of the 3 versions I'm covering, this is by far the loosest adaptation. 2001's Anne Frank, or Anne Frank the Whole Story, is the only version I'm covering today that is not an adaptation of Het Achterhuis. It primarily adapts the 1998 biography written by Melissa Mueller. As such, this is a broader look at Anne Frank's life, covering a period from 1939 to 1945. Despite being broadcast in 2 parts, it basically tells its story in 3 acts. Anne's girlhood in the Netherlands, her time in hiding covered by the diary, and her final months in captivity. Even beyond that, this movie's scope is much broader than just its heroine, giving far more attention to many of the other key players involved in the real events. Of the 3 films, this is the least focused given how much more ground it has to cover, but it's by far the most comprehensive. It's also, based on what I've read and seen, extraordinarily accurate to the real events. The only downside might be that this attention to detail and its expansive character roster might make it a bit harder to follow if you aren't already well versed. Finally, there's the 2009 BBC miniseries The Diary of Anne Frank. This one returns to the idea of adapting Anne Frank's diary itself. However, this one's not based on the stage play. It creates an entirely new interpretation. This achieves a balance between the 2 others. Like the 1959 movie, it largely stages its events in a single location. Anything that happens outside of the annex is not its concern outside of the occasional quick flashback. But like the 2001 movie, it's committed to telling that story as accurately as possible, not just in the broad strokes, but in the fine details. This one has the tightest focus and the most liberal use of scenarios from the diary itself. While it aired as a 5-episode miniseries in the UK, it was cut down to a 100-minute movie for its US release, and that's the only one I was able to find. So, how do they compare to each other? Most movies have to condense certain things in order to tell its story. The 1959 movie is quite deft at using shorthand to abbreviate complex topics into more digestible nuggets. For an easy example of what I mean, take the diary itself. Chances are you would recognize the image of this red checkered autograph book. It's the diary, right? Well, yes and no. It was the first diary, a present Anna received for her 13th birthday. But after over 2 years in hiding, her diary had grown to include other composition books and loose sheets of paper. Not only did Anna quickly run out of space in that book, there came a time when she decided she wanted to publish it after the war.
Then what we really need are ordinary documents, letters, and diaries.
He's talking to you, my love.
As such, she revised and polished sections of it, creating multiple drafts in the process. When her father ultimately published it, he combined portions of different drafts together. In other words, the literal diary of Anne Frank is far more complicated than just this one book. But you'd never know that from this movie, which treats her diary as a singular, complete object. Otto picks it up and reads it from cover to cover as if it's a final published manuscript. And that's fine. The autograph book is an iconic visual, instantly recognizable, easily picked up and passed around. It's shorthand. Anna wrote a diary. This is the diary. Does a movie really need to explain everything I just told you? Not even the other two movies with their attention to accuracy do that. They show it, making it clear her collection of writings spans far more than just this one book. They just don't ever call attention to it or explain it. Similarly, the diary is simplified to span their time in hiding and nothing else. In reality, Anna received her diary a month before she went into hiding, and her earliest entries are typical girl in the 40s stories, albeit against the backdrop of Nazi occupation. Both the latter movies demonstrate this, even the 2009 one in flashback. Given that the 1959 movie is based on a stage play and must keep its action confined to one setting, this auto gives Anna the diary only after they've gone into hiding. Here's another example of shorthand.
No.
But there's nobody down there now.
Doesn't matter. I don't ever want you to go beyond that door.
The truth is, the people in hiding were not confined to their hiding place at all times. They could never go outside, and as it was an active business, they had to be perfectly quiet during working hours. But on evenings and weekends, they had full access to the building. They would bring up food from the warehouse, the group would listen to the radio or work in the offices. Each occupant had a particular place they liked to bring the wash tub to bathe. In other words, they spent plenty of time on the opposite side of the bookcase, something the latter two movies frequently show. But again, this is a stage play. There's a unity of setting. Director George Stevens wanted to drive home that feeling of confinement, but the studio made him shoot the movie in super wide cinema scope. Considering the audience is only going to be trapped with them for 3 hours instead of 2 years, I can understand why the filmmakers would want to help expedite that audience connection by restricting its characters even more, and making the moments they do venture out more impactful. It's less concerned about the facts than it is about the essence of the experience. A final use of shorthand is in its helpers. See, the 8 people in hiding weren't completely alone. There were a handful of people in on the secret, primarily the 4 members of the office staff, but a few of the family members of that staff as well. Risking their own safety, they brought them food and other supplies in addition to running the business while Otto Frank was in hiding. Yes, it was Otto Frank's own employees who were keeping him safe. Next time you do a little bit of soul searching, ask yourself, if you ran a company, would you be the kind of boss your employees would risk going to a labor camp to protect? You can probably see why a movie might feel a bit put off at adding so many more characters on top of the 8 leads. As such, the 1959 movie distills the 4 office workers into Mr. Crawler and Meep. That's totally understandable as far as I'm concerned. The focus of this movie is on the people in hiding. The helpers really only exist to provide a rationale for how those people survive. They pop in from time to check in or provide news of the outside world. They are, in effect, one character, so having that role represented by half a dozen people would really gum up the works. That said, I think this goes a little too far with the shorthand.
We are over an old spice factory.
it somehow completely neglects to ever mention that Crawler and Meep are Otto's employees or that Otto has any connection to this business. How do they know each other? What's their relationship? This is so odd to me because this could have been instantly fixed, without even making the movie the slightest bit longer, just by changing Anna's line to say it was her father's spice factory. Bam! Everything falls into place. The other two films are significantly more factual when it comes to the helpers. Both of them keep all four of the main office workers, albeit with varying degrees of focus. They both also include Meep's husband Jan, who worked in the Dutch underground, although the cut of the 2009 film I'm watching reduces him to a mere mention. The 2009 film gives the helpers about as much prominence as the 59 version, but the 2001 film features them all pretty heavily. Given its broader focus, we spend more time seeing their struggles, trying to keep everything together and ward off danger. However, Meep Hees gets the biggest focus of the helpers. She's the one who recovered and held on to Anna's diary after they were arrested. She lived until 2010, spoke frequently about the experience, and wrote her own book about her and Jan's time during the occupation. Their story is fascinating on its own, and it's also been adapted for screens, such as The Attic starring Mary Steenburgen, and a new miniseries, A Small Light, that just came out this year. The 2001 film prefers to use Meep as the face of the helpers, its own less severe form of shorthand. There are only so many liberties a biopic can take, and each film chooses its own focus to inject realism into its narrative. For the 2001 and 2009 films, that's achieved by making their annex sets as close to the real layout as possible, something I didn't even realize until I was there. No joke, when I was at the Anne Frank house, I realized, to my surprise, that I knew exactly what room I was about to walk into before I even walked into it, and it was because I had watched the 2001 Anne Frank movie. I only single that one out specifically because I hadn't yet seen the 2009 movie, but it does as good a job. I should point out that the 59 movie has a fantastically impressive set. Stevens wasn't just concerned with making his audience feel what the characters are feeling, he wanted to ensure his actors did too. As such, rather than building individual sets with stairs leading to nowhere, his team built an actual multi-story annex on a soundstage. The actors actually did have to traverse it like a real place. The camera could literally travel up and down between floors. However, it doesn't look anything like the real location, and it doesn't have to. If we judged a biopic on how accurate its sets were, I doubt most would be any good. It injects realism into its set in other ways, particularly by filming its exteriors at the actual location, as opposed to, say, the 2001 movie, which filmed in the Czech Republic. It creates the illusion the Hollywood sets and the Amsterdam exteriors are one and the same through tricks like shooting out a window or even projecting plates behind actors. In order to drive home the feeling of confinement, the 1959 movie often shoots behind obstructions, making the setting feel cramped and cluttered. The 2009 movie seems to mostly shoot handheld, giving everything a shakier, more found footage feel. The structure is important too. The story of Anne Frank and the other occupants of the annex isn't terribly plot-driven. Despite the extreme circumstances, not much happens in the traditional sense. It's all about the little human dramas. People bicker, birthdays and holidays are celebrated, chores are carried out, boredom is staved off, love blossoms. It's about survival in the toughest situations, and how that doesn't stop us from going through the same day-to-day humdrum as anybody else. Despite the imminent threat of death and capture, it's a surprisingly cozy read. It's also hard to adapt into the structure of a film. The 1959 movie does it by distilling events into big moments. The Hanukkah scene, the threat of burglary, the date night, the air raids, the big fight over stealing food. The pet cat making noise and threatening to give them away is a huge moment of tension. The 2009 film goes in the opposite direction, focusing more on the small things, making little vignettes out of character moments. Listening in on a business meeting, noticing the cat's pees leaking through the floorboards, finding a place to take a bath, turning strawberries into jam for the company. Not to say each one doesn't explore the opposite extreme, but generally speaking, the 59 telling is about finding those important dramatic beats, while the 09 film is focused on the flashes of humanity. Quoting Anna herself, 8 people lived in hiding at 263 Prinsengracht. Those are 8 characters each adaptation has to include. 8 characters whose relationships more or less form the core of the story. All 3 movies seem to be in agreement in regards to portraying the Frank family itself. Otto is the kindly, respected patriarch who always manages to keep everything and everyone together.
Our motto, work and hope.
Work and hope. The only freedom is in here.
Edith is the long-suffering mother who cannot compete with Otto for her daughter's affections.
I'd sit right here beside you.
I'd rather you didn't.
So much suffering in the world.
Is that all you can say, Mother? Honestly, I don't know how you could be so thick sometimes.
Anne, that's no way to talk to your mother.
And Margot is the perfectly behaved daughter, the sharp contrast to her more outspoken and willful younger sister.
I'm only feeling sorry that I haven't anyone to whom to discuss my feelings.
I've no idea, have you? About what?
It's not easy trying to keep the peace.
I'm just your little sister.
You suck up the oxygen.
I'm trying to live. This is all we have.
I wish I could be like you.
The same can largely be said for the other families sharing the annex with them. The Van Pels family consisted of husband Herman, wife Augusta, and teenage son Peter. Herman also worked for Otto Frank, so his family joining them in hiding was a natural fit. For her diary, Anna assigned everyone but her family pseudonyms, presumably to protect their identities. As such, the Van Pels family became the Van Daan family. The 2 movies adapting the diary also use these pseudonyms, while the 2001 film uses all the players' real names. While there are differences between the interpretations, some more and some less sympathetic, the core character traits are the same. Mr. Van Pels Van Daan is a cigarette-smoking, bad-joke-telling grouch. Mrs. Van Pels Van Daan is a coquettish, opinionated flirt with a taste for finery. Peter is a shy and reclusive cat parent and, eventually, a love interest. See, Anna's diary is as much a coming-of-age story as anything else. Anna lived in hiding from age 13 to 15, pivotal moments in growing up. And she was very much preoccupied with growing up. In fact, she was very candid in her diary about sex and anatomy. They're the kinds of honest feelings and curiosities nearly all of us can relate to. Some form of those experiences are carried through all 3 of these retellings. When the diary was first published, Otto Frank edited out a lot of the references to sex, which later editions have added back in. That probably accounts for the latter 2 movies being a bit more, for lack of a better term, frank about such things.
I'd love to know what one feels like. May I?
No.
Good.
It was Jacqueline who told me that babies don't come out of their mother's tummies. She said, where the ingredients go in, that's where the finished product comes out.
As such, it's not terribly surprising that Anna would eventually develop a crush on the only boy she got to see for 2 years. It's also not surprising that Adaptations would jump at the chance to really play up that romantic arc while retelling a story without much in the way of traditional structure. Nowhere is that more apparent than in the 1959 film, where the slow burn from squabbling kids into full-blown Hollywood romance serves as the emotional crux of the film. Rather than 2 kids spending time together in the attic and getting occasionally affectionate, Anna is donning gloves and heels to walk across the annex for her super official date night. It certainly doesn't hurt that this Peter is played by Richard Bamer, just 2 years shy of Tony in West Side Story. They're very much leading man and leading lady, star-crossed lovers whose romance is cut tragically short. They hear the police coming for them and passionately embrace one more time as the orchestra swells to a fever pitch. The focus on the romance was such that when Joseph Schildkraut, who had reprised his role of Otto Frank from Broadway, saw the dailies, he famously complained the movie had become boy meets girl in an Amsterdam attic. While Peter dominates Anna's writings in the second half of the diary, it truly comes across as puppy love. Innocent and intense, but with ultimately nowhere to go. By the end of the diary, even Anna concedes that while she's grateful she finally took the steps to get close to him, they might be better suited as friends. The 2001 movie portrays the 2 of them far more realistically.
I must say I'm not certain I approve of all the necking.
I hate that word.
But even it can't seem to bear to let the romance go, even after they've been captured. Only the 2009 version addresses the possibility that Anna might be more interested in the chase than in the relationship.
I mean, you pick things up and then you suddenly get bored of them.
Is that all you can say, Mother? Can't you be happy for me?
Tellingly, she seems to realize she can't get the kinds of deep conversations from Peter that she wants in a partner.
Why is it that there's one law for Christians and another one for us? It's like if they do something wrong, then it's just what they do. But if you or I do something, it somehow reflects on all Jews.
Your hair looks nice today.
You're not listening.
It's not a sweeping tragedy. It's two kids growing with each other and away from each other and ultimately cherishing the experience. Another reason why Anna might have assigned her housemates pseudonyms is that she was a teenager in a confined space, stuck in an extreme situation with nowhere to vent but her diary. As such, her descriptions of the people she lived with were not always flattering.
She's just a fat, red-faced fishwife. Cunning, calculating, manipulative, grasping, vain, and coquettish.
Nowhere is that more evident than in regards to her roommate and arch-nemesis, Fritz Pfeffer. Pfeffer, a dentist, was very much the odd man out of the group. Once divorced, he had raised his son alone until sending him to England for his safety. He had to abandon his girlfriend to go into hiding and could only communicate with her through letters carried by Miep. He liked to be physically active and became very irritable in confinement. And unlike the other two families, he was very much alone.
No one has any sympathy. They have each other, you see.
Now imagine a teenage girl and a middle-aged man having to share this tiny room for 2 years. Anna disliked everything about him, from his bossy attitude, to his early morning calisthenics, to his prayers. Chief among their fights was over who got to use the room's desk and when. Even the pseudonym she chose for him, Albert Dussel, was intentionally insulting. Dussel, you see, is German for nitwit. The issue with the diary is that it's inherently one-sided, and since Pfeffer didn't survive to tell his own perspective, hers is the story the world knows. Who is the real man? The 2001 and 2009 films interpret him fairly true to life. The 2009 film in particular goes to great lengths to humanize him, to show his side of the story, and to demonstrate that Anne might not be that easy to live with either.
What lovely blonde hair. I like the flick-ups. She looks much younger than you.
I particularly like how it takes a moment to show how incredibly awkward this situation must have been for both of them. The 1959 movie, however, takes Anna's interpretation and runs with it, to the point that its Mr. Dussel becomes a completely different person. Far from the constantly exercising suave gentleman of real life, Dussel was played by portly comedic character actor Ed Wynn. And while his introductory monologue gives him a chance to be both sympathetic and dramatic,
She was alone for 2 days, and then they came and took her away.
he is mostly portrayed as buffoonish, a potato-counting, petty coward who is constantly whining about Anna and everything else. Rather than being devoutly religious, the fictionalized Mr. Dussel is so ignorant of Judaism, he has to be taught how to celebrate Hanukkah.
What kind of a Jew are you that you don't know Hanukkah?
It's a fantastic performance, don't get me wrong, but it's like the writers decided to go in the complete opposite direction of every character trait the real Pfeffer possessed. Needless to say, both Anna's diary and this interpretation infuriated his surviving partner. She thought it was an extremely disrespectful portrayal of someone who, let's not forget, died horribly in a concentration camp directly after these events. It just goes to show how vastly different interpretations can render the same person, and just how fraught it can be to dramatize the lives of real people. Perhaps the hardest character to pin down is the author of a diary herself. A reader gets so much insight into the author's thoughts, but very little objectivity as to how she interacts with or is seen by the others in her life. Anna is a fantastic diarist, and she is very open about her own faults, her seeming inability to get others to see the person she really is, rather than the annoying class clown she often comes across as. There's a lot to glean from the original work, many ways to fit the puzzle together based on the pieces. All of the adaptations incorporate certain shared core elements, but they all go in different directions in terms of the gaps they have to fill in. The 1959 version emphasizes the optimistic, spirited girl who will frequently break into dance or other theatrics. She ranges from the bratty younger sister to an earnest peacemaker. At 21, Millie Perkins was far older than the 13-year-old she's portraying. I've heard a lot of criticism of her acting.
Save me! Save me! No! No, don't take me!
I wouldn't say she's my favorite interpretation of the character. It's a bit too much romantic ingenue rather than insightful teen. But I think she captures the charming exuberance and vulnerability quite well. I think she only sounds stiff when doing voiceover for the diary narration.
I read A Tale of Two Cities through in that first day. It is a far, far better rest that I go to than I have ever known.
2001's Anne is portrayed by Hannah Taylor-Gordon, who has to age from 9 to 15 over the course of the movie. She also has to portray a far wider range than diarist in hiding, from the extremes of extroverted schoolgirl to prisoner in a concentration camp. Taylor-Gordon is a fantastic performer who knocks it out of the park, especially in that gut-wrenching final act.
I used to pray for you too, Anne. I prayed that your family was safe. I had no family.
The writing, however, especially in the second act, sometimes leans a bit too heavily into the idea of Anne Frank as a historical figure.
I don't want to hear that I'm like all other girls. I'm not. I'm me. Anne Frank.
She'll frequently burst into inspirational speeches.
We've suffered before and it's only made us stronger. One day people will look up to us.
And while that kind of pontificating sounds amazing in a diary, it comes across a bit less natural as dialogue. Ironically, I feel this movie captures her nuance best in its first act, outside of the confines of the diary, as this eternal chatterbox, just charming enough to get away with her antics.
God knows everything, but Anne knows everything better.
It makes sense that her parents would indulge her creativity while other adults would just roll their eyes at the interruption. I have a somewhat hard time believing that a 13-year-old would console Bep's worries about her dying father with a monologue about hope and nature.
Makes me wonder if God is a lot closer than most people think.
But I have an even harder time believing that if a kid did say that the adults would just eviscerate her for daring to try to say something nice.
Such a font of knowledge you've become.
This version tends to take Anne at her word that the grown-ups just don't understand her. The 2009 movie is far more critical of its Anne. Ellie Kendrick straddles that line between theatrically charming and annoyingly bratty. And the writing concedes that someone who is that outgoing, that opinionated, and that outspoken is probably going to be a bit of a jerk. She's a kid for all the good and ill that brings with it. And while that makes her a lot of fun and hopeful for the future, it can also make her a bit myopic and casually cruel.
And now, after a long struggle, the battle's over. I don't need you or my mother anymore.
We've been always on your side. However impossible you've been, I've encouraged you to be a writer. So that you can write me this.
This one portrays Anne as well-intentioned, but lacking in the graces to smooth things over. Her fights with the other residents aren't treated as the heroine versus the mean adults, but the results of ill-timed misunderstandings that would obviously appear unfair and cruel through one person's perspective.
Sniggering at us!
I'm not!
Why can't you stay in your own bloody room?
It takes advantage of the objectivity of the camera lens to draw distinctions between the narration and the events, to let us draw our own conclusions.
Why does he have to sleep here?
He has nowhere else to go.
But why with me?
But you have to make sacrifices for a good cause. And I'm glad I can make this small one.
And while a lot of this characterization comes down to interpretation, I find this one to be the most realistic, or at least the one that most gels with my own interpretation. When the occupants are arrested, both the 2001 and 2009 adaptations choose to add in a final scene between Anne and her nemesis. If anything like this actually happened, it's impossible to know, as neither participant lived to tell the tale. But since both movies decided to write the same scene, it demonstrates just how different their interpretations of the lead character are.
It's alright, Mr. Pfeffer. You'll see her again soon. I'm sure of it.
The 2001 version stays in line with the interpretation of Anne as sympathetic and forgiving. It's only now that Pfeffer understands that and comes to appreciate her. In the 2009 version, Anne is trying to get ready, but is shaking so hard from terror that she can't even buckle her own shoes. Suddenly, he stops her fumbling hands and puts on her shoes for her. The difference here is clear. In this version, it's Anne who has the realization that this man she can't stand, whom she's been excoriating in her diary for 2 years, is a person she never took the time to try to understand. It's one of the sweetest, most human moments.
Thank you, Mr. Russell.
And then I'm reminded that this attempt to humanize him is considerably deflated by essentially calling him Dr. Dumbass. More than anything, this makes me wish this had used the people's real names. Either one of these scenarios is plausible. It's easy to see how both were extrapolated from the same text, but it's clear how they both play to their own creation of Anne, either as the beacon of hope who will inspire generations, or the kid who still has a lot to learn, but won't get the chance. I think she was both. Due to this being a comparison, I've mainly focused on what these adaptations have in common with each other and the original book, that of the 2 Years in Hiding. However, only focusing on that does a disservice to all the material that Anne Frank the Whole Story includes that none of the others do. It provides so much more context for the life of not only its heroine, but all the other real people whose lives would be turned upside down. The first third of the movie is largely so tranquil and idyllic that it's hard to imagine the story being anything but a young girl making friends, having parties, meeting boys, going to school. Still, it does a good job showing the encroaching fascist threat, as rights are stripped away so slowly that they become the new normal. That's the thing. None of this started with concentration camps. It started with having to register, then having to go to different schools, not being allowed to go to the movies or ride streetcars, not being allowed to run certain businesses. It's held up by offering the in-group things that might advantage them.
Papa's been out of work for so long. Mother said Hitler would make jobs here the same way he did in Germany.
It's chipping away at the foundations a little bit at a time until it's just normal to be called up to a work camp. All totally fine and proper here. It's amazing how easily we tend to adapt and presume that things will be alright. Yes, this silly Hitler cosplay moment actually did happen. The fact of the matter is, despite how it all turned out, the Franks and Van Pelses were very savvy to have made their preparations to hide long before they actually needed to, so that it was ready the moment they did. As for the third act, the months of concentration camps, I can see different schools of thought as to the necessity of its inclusion. The 1959 movie doesn't even show them being captured, staging a largely fictionalized final sequence that ends just moments before the police break through. There is artistic value in stopping here, leaving the rest to the imagination of the audience. It's still just as heartbreaking to see the 59 characters about to be captured, to understand what they're going to face, without actually seeing any of it happen. From the perspective of narrative structure, it doesn't make a lot of sense to spend all this time in concentration camps for no other reason than seeing our main characters slowly die. Logically, if you devote all this time in the story to it, you expect them to make it out the other side. But there is no making it out the other side. Our heroine just suffers and suffers and suffers until she literally cannot anymore. So I can see the argument that this is unnecessary, maybe even exploitative. However, this isn't just a story. it's reality. Anne Frank didn't slip quietly into the night with her head held high, carried off into a clean, bloodless historical legacy so that she could be commemorated as a statue. She suffered through indignities, starvation, and disease, just like countless other people did. The cruelty was the point, enacted by those in power. And I feel we risk minimizing the impact of that suffering if we turn away from it and simply leave it at, and then they died somehow. And this movie goes to great lengths to present that experience as accurately as possible. I mean, there is only so much you can do to make healthy, well-fed actors look like the real victims. Thankfully. Clearly, I'm more comfortable showing scenes from this movie than I would be images from actual concentration camps. What I mean is, I had read and watched a lot of interviews with survivors who had encountered Anne Frank in the camps, and there were several times watching this when I thought, yeah, that perfectly matches those accounts. In other words, they don't appear to be making up scenarios for drama or shock value. This is pretty close to the facts. A moment in the diary that's always stood out to me is where Anna recounts a dream she had of her friend, Hannah Goslar, in a concentration camp. Anna writes about her guilt of living in relative safety and comfort while her friend is presumably suffering, possibly dying. It's a surprising perspective to be reminded that even those trapped in hiding could consider themselves fortunate by comparison. Clearly it didn't just stand out to me, as both the 59 and 01 movies dramatize that moment. It carries far more weight in the 2001 film, given that Hannah Goslar is a major character throughout the first act of the story, as is her family. We even see them rounded up by the Nazis after Anne and her family are in hiding, so we know the nightmare isn't far from the truth. Ignoring the concentration camp elements removes what I think is perhaps the saddest irony of Anna's story, because she and Hannah did reunite in the final weeks of Anna's life, but their fortunes were drastically reversed. Hannah survived the war. In fact, she only died last year. Hannah and her family were classified as Jews the Nazis could trade, and lived in relatively better conditions. I certainly emphasize relatively because other members of her family, including her father, still died in captivity. Instead of Anne feeling guilty over Hannah, it's now Hannah who has to toss over a Red Cross package she received so her friend won't starve to death. It's the most heartbreaking setup and payoff I've ever seen, made all the more so given that it wasn't created by a Hollywood writer, but by real life. It's a stunningly horrific realization of just how dramatically fortunes can reverse themselves, and that under fascism, nobody from the out-group can ever be truly safe. Especially for true stories, endings can be a bit difficult. Life doesn't tend to have tidy endings. No more apparent is that than in the diary itself, which suddenly stops 3 days before their capture, with added text bluntly stating, Anna's diary ends here. While the editions I've read include an epilogue to provide context of what happens after the narrative, its abrupt ending practically shouts the answer to the rooftops. The story ends because the author never got to write again. That's what's so chilling about those words, Anna's diary ends here, because they tell you everything you need to know without telling you anything. There's no way a movie can effectively capture that the exact same way. In attempting to craft their own endings, the three movies diverge wildly. The 1959 film sets its entire narrative within a framing device. The movie opens with Otto returning to the hiding place after the war. Its main story is told through Otto reading his daughter's account of those events. I think that's smart, to acknowledge that the story you're seeing is the diary itself, rather than a fully objective fly-on-the-wall viewpoint. While cutting away just before capture is a very effective moment, the movie goes to absurd lengths to justify how that was in the diary.
And so it seems our stay here is over. That means I must leave you behind.
Yeah, the Nazis gave their prisoner time to write one last diary entry and the opportunity to hide said diary so that it wouldn't be lost when they the Nazis, confiscated all of their possessions. That makes sense. I would have much preferred no explanation at all. I can just assume that part of the story is there because Otto was the one recounting it and he was also present to have witnessed it. It ends by returning to the framing device, on Otto describing to Crawler and Meep the fates of everyone else and reflecting on his daughter's wisdom. It ends on a voiceover of Anne Frank's most famous quote, thus cementing her status in history.
In spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart.
Despite the very different structure, the 2001 movie ends in a similar place to the 1959 one. We follow Anne through her torments at Westerbork, Birkenau, and Bergen-Belsen until her sister, Margot, dies of typhus, leaving her completely alone and hopeless. The story picks up after the war and reveals that Otto, whom we haven't seen in half an hour, actually did survive. The last several minutes consist of Otto trying to track down what happened to his daughters. And I must say that Ben Kingsley breaks my heart with the understated ways in which he shows his trauma.
And Edith?
She's not coming back.
Let's go inside.
Mr. Van Pearls, I saw with my own eyes, been taken to the gas chamber. He was in the barracks when he should have been at work. He just gave up. And you could never do that. Me, Margot and Anne are not coming back.
Meep presents Otto with his daughter's writings, and he reads them, not to start a flashback, but so we can see a man rediscover his child through the only piece of her that still exists. The movie ends with a montage describing in text what happened to all the characters. It's a fairly stock ending for biopics, but I find this one not only informative but also very moving. Given how long we spend in the camps, I had actually gotten used to seeing the characters shaved and dirty and broken. The juxtaposition reminding me how they should be is a shock to my system and hits me pretty hard every time. It ends with an eerie, almost ethereal shot of Anne on a train, looking directly into the camera as the screen fades to a blinding white. I appreciate that this movie's final word on the subject, after 3 hours of getting to know these people intimately, is that they are just the tiniest tip of the iceberg. That every other victim has a story, and those stories are just as important. The 2009 movie opts for simplicity delivered with surgical precision. It too fudges the details a little for the sake of completion. Anne is writing in her diary right up to the moment of her capture, with her most famous quote being her final words.
In spite of everything, people are good at heart.
Framed this way, though, it seems the work itself is challenging the quote's validity, questioning whether people are really good at heart, as she says. It ends with them being led down the stairs for the last time. But while their fates are unknown to them, the movie knows, and it freeze frames on each character, one at a time, to tell us. The 2001 version used a similar device for its ending, but this one hits hard and fast. Dead, dead, dead. Both of these epilogues hit me hard, but I'm amazed how much this one does with so little. The rapid succession and clinical coldness become overwhelming very quickly, no matter how many times I see it. Its effectiveness is the best argument you could make that you don't actually need to show the concentration camps. There's no epilogue, nothing of Otto after the war. There's simply one final shot of Meep returning and picking the little diary up off the floor, thus setting history into motion. This is the only one that even attempts to capture the abruptness of the diary, adding just enough to understand the context and nothing more. I could go on in greater detail, but this is probably going to be one of the longest videos I've ever done. As I said when I opened, I find our storytelling traditions fascinating. How different storytellers can emphasize different aspects, hit the same emotional beats in different ways. They can all get to the same kernel of truth, even if some of the details are altered. I think each of these adaptations has its own strengths. 1959's The Diary of Anne Frank is Anne Frank's story through the lens of the golden age of Hollywood. It's by far the most cinematic, the one that does the most to convey tension through lighting and blocking and silence. Given the real Anna's obsession with movies and movie stars, this is probably the kind of movie she would have wanted to see about herself. It's not always factually accurate, but it encapsulates its moods of terror, of warmth, of humor in the small things. Its strength is in providing a beautiful movie experience. I would just warn you that you shouldn't come away from it expecting to understand the facts of the real people and events. 2001's Anne Frank The Whole Story is exactly what it says it is, the whole story. If the 1959 movie is an epic through its grand music and cinematic framing, this movie is an epic through its huge narrative and equally large cast of characters. It's a long-form family drama. It is accurate almost to a fault, and it delivers scads of information and context that not even the diary itself has. It does, however, make the controversial decision to pin their betrayal on a specific person. Regardless of whether you've read the book, this is a fantastic supplement to it. You're not going to find cinematography on par with 1959. It's a made-for-TV movie and is perfectly competent, if not always convincing, and it has some fantastic performances. Its strength is in providing a complete world with a breadth of detail. 2009's The Diary of Anne Frank proves you can adapt the book in a way much more faithful to the source material without sacrificing interesting drama. Due to its narrower focus, it's able to recreate far more of the details of their time in hiding than even the 2001 movie. So many scenarios are lifted straight out of the book almost verbatim. It eschews historical context and the bigger picture for a sweet, simple coming-of-age story. Its strength is its characterization, delivering by far the most nuanced portrayals of its 8 leads. I wouldn't recommend not reading the diary itself, but in a pinch, this is a decent substitute for it. It's certainly a fantastic adaptation of it. Overall, though, I think the 2001 movie is my favorite. It could be because it's the first dramatization I watched, but I love the more comprehensive approach, the fantastic performances, and its commitment to accuracy. When I was in Amsterdam and we arrived at the Anne Frank house, my friends immediately wanted to take a picture of me in front of it, because they knew how much I had looked forward to being there. And I'm glad I have those photos, but they're probably the most awkward photos I've ever taken. I didn't know what to do. Should I smile? Was the whole prospect disrespectful? And that basically sums up the struggle I've had in making this video, because I want to be respectful, while also sharing something I care about very deeply. The truth is, engaging with this material is emotional for me, even painful. But I don't suffer through it. I don't force myself to read or watch it out of a sense of guilt or obligation. I legitimately enjoy it. Not in the same kind of upbeat, rah-rah way I do with other stories I care about, but I enjoy it nonetheless. And that's weird, because the story is shadowed by death and pain and evil. It's surrounded by horrible darkness. And that context is essential. This story almost certainly wouldn't have the reach that it does without existing in that context. But that's not all that it is. It's certainly not what its author wrote, the author who didn't know that that would be the ultimate context for her story. So just as much as all of that, I see this story as one of love, of exploration, of family, of petty arguments, of boredom, of growth, of small failures and tiny victories. It's life. I want to be respectful of how they died, and it's vitally important to understand why, so it never happens again. But I don't want that to overshadow that they are more than just how they died. This diary, this story, in all of its forms, chronicles how people lived. And that is what's so special.